Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome once again to another online Bible study for the Crossing Community Church. Well, we continue with our study of the essentials of Christianity, and we're going to be studying the book of Acts, starting in the 17th chapter and beginning with the 16th verse, and eventually working our way through to the 31st verse. The focal point is again going to be our daily conversations are opportunities to share Christ. You know, each day we have windows of opportunity to share Jesus, but we can easily miss them if we're not looking forward them, if we're not intentional about that. Jesus wants to tell us his story and tell his story through us, and we need to be ready to share. During Paul's second missionary journey, after sharing the gospel and experiencing persecution in Philippi, Paul and his companions moved on to Thessalonica and Berea, where they still faced stiff Jewish opposition. While Silas and Timothy stayed in Berea, Paul traveled to Athens, where he waited for his friends. There he worked to connect with the residents, and he used that influence to evangelize one of the Roman Empire's most important cities. Well, verses 16 through 18 read, "While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jew and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace, day by day, with those who happened to be there. Well, a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him, and he enjoyed it. Well, some of them asked, 'What is this babbler trying to say?' Others remarked, 'He seems to be advocating foreign gods.' And they said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Well, Paul had a window of opportunity in Athens, and this opportunity came with the grief he felt over the godliness he saw in the city. Paul noticed an air of spiritualism that had nothing to do with God. And through the people, and though those people were engaged in worship, it was idolatrous. Well, between Sabbaths, Paul could be found out amongst the people in the city. And in Athens, he walked into the marketplace, which is called the Agora, and he sparked conversations. Well, in this marketplace, he met two types of thinkers. Epicurean philosophers. They believed that the purpose of life was in finding pleasure and eliminating pain. And they thought that God, if he existed at all, was not involved in our lives. Furthermore, they did not believe in life after death. The Stoic philosophers, on the other hand, were pantheist. They worshiped many gods. They believed in the ultimate divine principle that exists throughout the universe and nature, including human beings. They believed that the way to realize your fullest potential was to live by reason and reason alone. They valued self-sufficiency. The Stoics believed they could eliminate suffering through intellectual perfection. We should be sensitive to opportunities to share the gospel. In the next verses, we learn that we should also find common ground for introducing the gospel. In verses 22 and 23, we read, "Paul then stood up in a meeting of the Areopagus, and he said, 'People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with the inscription, "To an unknown God." So you are ignorant of the very thing that you worship. And this is what I am going to proclaim to you.' So as Paul engaged the Athenians, he looked for an open door to draw them into conversation. He acknowledged they were religious, knowing full well their religion had nothing to do with the one true God. Yet, that point of commonality was a springboard for him to talk about what they didn't know. And what they didn't know was Jesus. They just didn't even believe in one God. But the apostle was actively looking for some way to connect with the people around him. We may think people aren't open to hear the gospel. They often are willing to discuss spiritual matters when we start with a point of commonality, which places both parties on equal ground. To be clear, there are different beliefs and they are not equal. But as followers of Christ, we never should approach the conversation with an air of superiority. Instead, we need to humble ourselves and seek those pieces of connection as an opening to share God's important message of truth. Well, begin to look and listen for that common ground. Concerns people talk about: the team logo they wear, the religious symbols they display. Any and all of these can be conversation starters that lead to discussions about the gospel. Well, in the next verses, we learn that we must help others understand and the truth of the gospel. Verses 30 and 31 tell us, "Come up, and in the past God overlooked such ignorance. But now he commands all people everywhere, repent, for he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead." Now, it's great to go where people are and get involved with their doing and what they're doing with. It's great to ask questions and start discussions about it. But it doesn't end there. To stop there is like walking away from the marathon just short of the finish line. We must get to the truth of what Jesus did to make their relationship with God possible. And as Paul spoke to the Athenians at the Areopagus, he framed the message in terms familiar to his listeners. He'd identified their poets, and he spoke their language, but he still got down to the gospel. The Athenians struggled to accept God as creator and judge, and to believe in Jesus' resurrection. But on these points, Paul didn't compromise in the truth. In our own encounters and conversations, we also need to represent and present the full gospel. Responding to the gospel requires that we acknowledge the sin that separates us from God. We need to accept that a price had to be paid for those sins we committed. Now, this leads us to recognize that Jesus was the only acceptable sacrifice for sin. Finally, we need to understand that Jesus became our substitute so we could be brought into a relationship with God. Jesus freed us from a deadly debt, and that is amazing good news. So during this next week, I encourage you to choose one of the following applications of our study today. Open your heart. Pray and ask God to make you aware of the opportunities around you to talk about your faith. Pray for a willingness to share Christ with others. Open your eyes. Make a list of areas of interest you share with other people. And with a list, identify ways those areas of interest could be used to turn the conversation to the gospel. Open your mouth. Be diligent about maximizing your windows of opportunity to share Christ. Be intentional and making natural bridges between you and another person to talk about the gospel. It's easy to get busy and even so focused on good things that we lose awareness of those people God is bringing across our path. But just as Paul seized those opportunities, so must we if the message of the gospel is to be read to those who need to hear it. When you pray this week, ask God for boldness to turn our daily conversations into gospel conversations. Thank Him for the privilege of serving Him as His witnesses. Well, again, it's been a joy and a delight to be with you as we continue our study of the essentials of Christianity. I look forward to seeing you again next week. And May God continue to bless you in your efforts on his behalf. Thank you so much.